Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This webinar, my name is Stephanie Lambert and I'm a partner at HFW. I'm also an executive committee member on the EC of Women Lawyers Association New South Wales. This webinar is the first in a four-part series brought to you by the Welcome to Law Committee of WLA NSW. The Welcome to Law Committee is hosting a number of webinars, which is looking at providing relevant information to law students, graduates and young lawyers to help them navigate through the legal industry. I'm lucky enough to be joined today by my panellists. We've got Sam Gray, who is Director of Montgomery Advisory. We've got Carolyn Chudleigh, my colleague, who's a partner at HFW. She's the Sydney Practice Head of HFW and also the head of our construction division internationally, and Judy Tomas, who's the head of legal at Mission Australia. So for the questions, we're happy to take them through the chat function. If you want to raise a question, feel free to ask it through the Q&A and we'll endeavour to respond to them all. If you've got a question which is directed to one of our panellists, feel free to put their name in there as well, otherwise any of the panellists might pick it up. So we'll get started. Sam, I've got the first question for you.
Yep, sure.
So we've seen a lot of changes in the legal industry this year. Can you speak to us about what you've seen from a legal recruitment perspective, including areas of growth or contraction and potential challenges you see for people entering these areas?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a good question in the current environment. So from a legal recruitment perspective, coming into end of March, it was a pretty buoyant market, generally speaking, across the board. And then obviously COVID, which is lurking behind the scenes, reared its head and everyone saw its teeth, basically. And I would say by mid-April, particularly in law firms, 95% of roles were put on hold indefinitely. So it created a lot of uncertainty, understandably, for anyone either looking for a job or particularly people in their penultimate or final year at law school, I would have thought, looking forward, to are they going to be able to get a grad role next year? But interestingly, and we've been speaking to a number of different law firms, the impact hasn't been as great on law firms' revenue, bottom line, as necessarily predicted, which all bodes well for confidence in hiring grads next year. And law firms being law firms and lawyers being lawyers, they're like accountants, and my accountant bill has gone up month on month since COVID started. So I imagine a lot of legal bills have gone up too, because people get scared, they ask for extra advice, and there's a few more hoops and hurdles to jump through. But we're seeing law firms, the way they're set up, to sort of, it's like a hedge really, when litigation's busy, corporate might be quiet and vice versa. And since sort of, I guess, May, the areas that have really ramped up have been projects, infrastructure, which is probably not surprising if you look at the forecast of money going to be pumped into by the state governments, in particular New South Wales, Victoria, and also the federal government. There's a friend of mine just joined Sydney Metro, and they're confident they've got 10 years of work as we speak right now forecasted. So construction projects, if you have government clients or even other side, even if you're dealing with private, the contractors are all going to get involved as well. So that's going to kick on for the foreseeable future. Employment law as well is an area that was already busy and got increasingly busy. Whenever there's change, restructuring, employment law it's generally a safe area, but it gets busier in times of distress. And insurance law has not, insurance law and I guess class actions in particular have maintained, been relatively busy as well. And I'd say finally the other area that, which people don't like to talk about is insolvency, I guess, from a restructuring front. Insolvency lawyers, they don't often admit it publicly, but they love disasters and downturns. And, it's their time to shine, Unfortunately for them, there is no restructuring front-end insolvency lawyers in the market, so they can't recruit anyone because it hasn't happened since 2008 to 2010. But that's a busy space, and I think there's a lot of grads that are going to be funneled into that space over the coming years. So my prediction from chapters from major firms who do the majority of graduate paralegal recruitment is that they're not going to cut graduate numbers next year. And in fact, some of the boutique firms, particularly ones that are well positioned in the infrastructure employment space and some of the private equity M&A firms, they're looking to take on people right now. So I think all in all, it's definitely quieter on the recruitment front at the senior end, but week in, week out, we're seeing more and more roles coming through, and we're in the recruitment business, right? So we maintain income when people are confident in hiring, and we're busy. So I guess that's a good sign for the future. And I've got friends who are in the corporate world. Their view on it now is, do we just wait forever, or do we just get on with it? And it seems like people are getting on with it. And when people are getting on with it, lawyers are getting on with it too. So my view is it's not as bad as it may seem. And if I was a future graduate, I'd have some sense of optimism, I guess, about where we're heading in a snapshot. Yeah.
The areas that you've spoken about are the same areas that we're seeing as well. And Carolyn, I'm interested to hear from you, because you are the head of the international practice group, and also you're seeing the changes on a domestic front. Previously, we saw quite a lot of movement for graduating young lawyers in travelling for work and getting experience, particularly over in the Middle East and the UK. Do you still see those opportunities there, or do you think now that we're all on Zoom and online that those opportunities have declined?
Indeed, thanks. And thank you for the invitation to come today as well to talk. It's an area that I'm quite interested in, which is what will be the future of law firms. Regarding that question, it's very interesting to follow where the talent is moving globally. Sam's already talked about the, dare I call it, the hot areas at the moment, but following where the talent is, and I'll answer that then in two parts. Are there going to be opportunities overseas? Well, first thing is, what do the clients actually want out of their legal service providers or any professional service firms these days? What do the clients actually want out of the service providers, given the new world where there's a lot more online meetings? Some of the clients still operate where they value the face-to-face discussions. Other clients will respond by saying, that's all right, we don't care where you are physically situated in the world, we can do it that way. So first test is really, and it's a test for the business, the law firm, what do the clients actually want and how do they best perceive the use of their service providers? The second part to that question also is the type of legal work. So there's certain types of legal work that lend themselves better to actually doing it online. For example, banking and finance, heavy in the documentation, follow the formula. Yes, you negotiate the documents, but a lot of that can basically be done online anywhere. Whereas other areas, you might need a site inspection. Okay, site inspections can be done with drones or virtually in any case, but there may well be other areas that still involve and are still best achieved by actually having physical presence. So then analyse and assess the actual type of legal work you're doing. The next part to that question as well is the training of young lawyers. I keep hearing now, both from the young lawyers but also the partners in the firm, that in order to get the best out of their new lawyers coming through their legal teams, there's a certain amount of growth as a lawyer that you get from being on the job. Osmosis from being physically in the office or close to the senior practitioners to actually learn how they're doing things. People might have heard of, and whether or not it's right or wrong, but the 70-20-10 models. You get 70% of your knowledge and training from actually doing the job on the task. The other 20% is feedback, and then 10% from courses and textbooks. So there might be something in that to consider as well, is that how do you actually progress as a lawyer? How do you learn as a lawyer? And maybe this is also a question for the universities. They're going to have to work out how best to teach the study of law and then the practical application of that. Now, we'll just finish though by saying I've been lucky to be involved in a think tank discussion between the Australian members of Australian law firms and English law firms and the English Law Society regarding the UK and Australia trade agreement, free trade agreement, focusing on the actual mobility of lawyers around the world. There's a big push to get mutual recognition across the UK and Australia, and a real lobby being done that actually having a law degree will fall under the free trade agreement as something where there's going to be mutual recognition, so you can practice in either jurisdiction without, and get admitted in the jurisdictions to practice without actually having to go through and study ethics and constitution and whatnot again, because the disciplines are very close. Maybe not so much for the Middle East unless you're practicing English law in the Middle East. But it's been a very interesting discussion to see the breaking down of the borders. When you have a law degree from an Australian university, can you actually transport that elsewhere? So I do think, in answer to the question, there will be opportunities very much so in the future for young lawyers to still travel overseas and use their law degrees, because there's going to be a freeing up of that talent. So hopefully that's helpful for those attendees.
Particularly so because one of the barriers that there has been previously is having to do that extra study whenever you came over to Australia or over to the UK. Judy, with the current economic crisis that we're experiencing globally, there's been a real big push to have an increase of services provided from the non-for-profit sector. And with your experience being in the housing division, I'm just wondering if you could speak to us about what opportunities there might be for graduate and young lawyers in the non-for-profit area, and in moving into this area, what would be something that they would really need to know about?
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks for having me today. I just wanted to mention that I am on Gadigal land, and I do pay my respects to the elders of First Nations people, both past, present and future. So then I thought I'd bring along some stats, some interesting stats about the not-for-profit sector today, and it's probably something that I never actually appreciated the depth of the sector before I was actually in it, because like some others on the panel, I actually started my life out as a practitioner in private practice. So I actually gravitated to the not-for-profit sector after I did what I call my tour of duty in private practice. And so these statistics from a recent study actually done by Social Ventures Australia and CSI, the Centre for Social Impact. And it might be interesting to anyone contemplating a career in the not-for-profit sector who's listening to the webinar. So effectively there are over 16,000 registered charities in Australia. Not all of them employ people, but that's a hefty number. If you look at the revenue, that the annual revenue that's actually paid to not-for-profits, it's equivalent to 8% of the GDP. It's huge. The other factor is that 1 in 10 of us are actually employed by the not-for-profit sector, and that equates to more than 1.3 million people working in the sector. And obviously volunteers play a huge part in how the sector operates, which is equivalent to about $12 billion in wages from volunteers. So the sheer size of those numbers should actually give some grads and lawyers contemplating to working in the sector some hope as to actually the depth of opportunities that might be available. I think reflecting the details brought in by started by Sam in the beginning of the session, we've seen a huge uptick in Mission Australia in demand for legal services, of our internal legal services. So when COVID actually started, we had to get on top of a whole lot of new legislation that impacted upon our service delivery. But because we're a national charity, we had to get on top of all the different jurisdictions. In my space, in the housing space, lots of different ways of tackling residential tenancy law changes, rent relief. So we had to get on top of that really, really quickly. In looking at the NFP job boards and in our own recruitment, there's been a huge uptick in frontline services recruitments. So the emphasis in the not-for-profit sector, it's always about people, and labour is by far the biggest spend. You know, you're talking about 75 to 80% of any program cost is labour. And so a lot of that at the moment has been funneled into the frontline services. In terms of legal, we actually do run quite a big legal department for a charity, probably because we have so many service lines in various different areas. And so you naturally sort of develop some expertise within a generalist legal team. But the most often way I think people start in the not-for-profit sector, and if I have a message to the people on the call, is you generally start on a temporary opportunity. So don't be afraid to take up a 3-month contract engagement or even shorter. I actually came in on a 3-week specialist project engagement and never left. So those opportunities are really fantastic and do arise more frequently. As a sector and as a legal team, we're constantly scrambling, trying to put together and look for resources to be able to assist us in the limited budget that we actually have to operate in. And so we have to be a little bit creative in how we get some of that talent. I would also suggest to anyone looking to enter into the sector is to look at some job boards that are specific to the sector. So, for example, Ethical Jobs is one of the biggest job boards for our sector, as well as Pro Bono Australia, and you do see legal jobs advertised occasionally there. So keep a lookout on those sources. Volunteering is obviously a good path as well, and one thing that I guess I would recommend to you is don't necessarily just look at legal volunteering opportunities. We've actually had lawyers come through skilled volunteering programs in other areas. One of them has recently come in from marketing, so utilising your digital skills and other non-legal skills could actually get you into the door, into the not-for-profit sector and into the legal team eventually. It might just be slightly indirect and not direct. And the other thing I just wanted to say is if you're looking to work for our sector, it is a values-based organisation and values-based work. So you need to understand your why, and you need to understand the why of the organisation that you're seeking. So why do they do what they do, and does that drive you? Does that drive the purpose? It's probably fair to say that generally not-for-profit salaries are considerably less than private practice, and so you know it's usually driven by passion and mission.
You spoke a little bit there about getting into the legal not-for-profit sector by doing some alternative pathways, and I think that's a good segue to the next question I have, which is for Sam. So we know about the usual pathway to law, which is to get the sums of clerkship and then do the graduate role. What about alternative pathways to law when you haven't been able to secure one of those positions? How else can you get into practice in the legal industry? Yeah,
well, I mean, I was guilty of that myself. I wasn't lucky enough to get a role at a top-tier law firm, and one of the reasons I speak to the law students about this is if you don't go get a job through back then I was a graduate, now it's summer clerkship. When you try and find out who to apply to, there's no avenue for you. There's no, you can't search graduate jobs in law firms in Sydney and it brings out all the firms that potentially hire grads. So interestingly enough, like only between 12 and 15% of firms participate in the formal graduate program of firms in New South Wales. Now, obviously they're the major firms, but that leaves a vast majority of firms out there who like to hire grads. Sometimes advertise, sometimes they don't, but you need to know who they are. And that's there's a bit of a missing link there in my opinion. So I try and help people out with, and I'm happy to speak to anyone after this if they want to drop me an email about who the firms are, because the firms appreciate it. And I know the junior lawyers, graduates also appreciate it, but there's quite a number of specialist legal firms, international law firms as well. And firms like, you guys may have heard of, like Hogan Lovells, for example. They recruit through their paralegal system. There's a firm called Quinn Emanuel, a large US litigation firm. They recruit through paralegals and occasionally advertise for graduates. There's a firm called Arnold Block Liebler that's decided it doesn't want to be part of the CV Mail graduate system anymore. They actually use us to hire their graduates because they can't be bothered doing it themselves. It's too time intensive, which it is. And then there's a whole raft of firms across Australia that across employment law, insurance law, corporate law, property, construction, insolvency, IPIT as well. And good firms. So firms started by ex-top tier international or even mid-tier or even just quality practitioners who have unbelievable clients, but no one knows who they are. So if you've missed out on a summer clerk program and you feel like you missed out on a grad program, all is not lost because there's plenty of opportunities for you to look at. And on that, as a stepping stone, when a Kingwood Mallesons or a Freehills is looking to hire a lawyer, or Holman Fenwick Willen, for example, where do they get them from? They're not getting them from another top tier law firm because people won't see the value proposition. They've got to go to a quality boutique or mid-tier firm to hire these people. So, and on that, if you've been a grad at, say, a employment firm, you start in employment and you finish in employment. If you join Freehills, you do 3 rotations. You rotate through employment, maybe corporate, maybe litigation. So by the time you're an 18-month lawyer, you've only actually had 6 months actual practical experience. If you were trying to get a job then, good luck in the market. But if you've been in the boutique or in the one team at a national, international law firm, you've got 18 months experience. You're actually a valuable asset all of a sudden. So there is a school of thought that's actually not a bad path to go down. I know top tier lawyers don't agree with that, but that's, they've been brainwashed from an early age, in my opinion. But how do you do it, I guess, is the question. So I'm happy to speak to you about it, but you can find it. You can spend a lot of time researching who the firms are that you want to approach. You go on their website. Sometimes you get lucky that they happen to have a graduate or even a paralegal role advertised. Sometimes you see it on Seek or LinkedIn. More often than not, though, they don't advertise because they don't want to advertise because they want to be inundated with applications. So you just approach them directly. I don't believe in cover letters anymore. People might disagree with me, but put together a cover email. Partners don't have time to read anything overly detailed. They're busy. Attach a CV, attach a transcript, send it in. You most likely you won't hear back. But what you should do is 3 or 4 days later, call up. They will, when they pick up the call, it's not like a cold call because you'll reference your email. They might be apologetic they never responded to you. So you have a conversation. They may say, look, not interested, but they will remember you, hopefully. Or you might be in luck. And if you display a passion for that, they might have a coffee with you and away you go. If you do that often enough, someone somewhere will hire you and then you'll be on your way. And if it's within an area that you enjoy, great. And, if you've got a dream of being in an international law firm or a top tier law firm, all is not lost because that is a genuine pathway. And, half my time as a recruiter, I recruit into boutique law firms. And particularly during COVID, they've probably been the most active firms recruiting because they've got a low cost structure. Their client base is kind of in the sweet spot for the current climate, and they're doing really well. So their appetite is kind of large. So yeah, there's definitely an alternate pathway, and you can get really good experience, and you'll be valued in the top tier when you get there one day if you want to go down that path.
So I've just seen we've got a few questions here. I'll raise this one with you, Sam, because we're on the topic. It says, I live in regional New South Wales, Newcastle. There is only one firm offering a graduate program here, Hall & Wilcox. what advice can you offer to Pathway to Employment in regional areas?
Well, there's quite a few law firms in Newcastle. I'd be happy to, if that person wants to send me an email, I'd be happy to direct them in the right direction. But there's a number of boutique law firms up there. I mean, there's not just Horn Cox, there's Spark Helmore, there's Moore and Agnew, there's McCulloch Robinson, there's an international law firm called DWF, for example, all have strong Newcastle presences and don't have a graduate program. I know for a fact they employ graduates because my cousin was employed in one of them as a graduate and he applied directly. And then there's a whole raft of quality mid-sized firms in Newcastle, which is a genuine stepping stone. So we actually placed a lawyer from a construction firm in Newcastle into Pinson Masons in Melbourne. A firm, I'll be honest with you, I'd never heard of them, but when I looked at them, they did really good work. So I think you just need to know where to look. And again, I'm happy to help because I've done the mapping, the market. But if you don't know where to look, it's kind of hard and you've got to trawl through websites. But there's certainly a pathway in Newcastle. But if you're happy to travel to Sydney, there's obviously more options than in Newcastle. So.
Or just go straight to Sam. He'll give you the inside scoop.
Yeah. Maybe not everyone, but a few people.
Judy, there's a question for you here as well. It says, how have you been handling the changes to housing due to COVID-19 and the law? Have there been an increase in the number of people accessing your service?
Great question. Essentially, in the housing space, not so much because we generally run at full capacity and occupancy anyway, even before COVID. The government has put out special funding for basically taking rough sleepers and putting them into homes so that they can have a place to quarantine if they need to during COVID. So we have received funding for that. The other point to note is, unlike commercial tenancies, social housing tenants their revenue sources and income tends to be through Centrelink and Social Security, and counterintuitively, I suppose, because of JobKeeper, their income actually rose. So we were thinking that we might actually have a rental arrears issue, but that actually didn't eventuate. That was more in our affordable housing portfolio, which is a bit like market housing, and it's just a discount to market, where tenants actually were applying to us for rent relief under the COVID measures. In terms of actually doing the servicing, one challenge during COVID has been to make sure that, for example, we can keep doing maintenance inspections on some of our housing. So when you're dealing with vulnerable people, sometimes if you don't actually treat issues like hoarding and squalor, that can actually impact on the quality of the housing. The other thing that we're seeing, and also reflecting back on what Sam said right at the beginning, is because the government is pumping money into infrastructure projects, that there is a lot of focus on social affordable housing projects at the moment through various arms of government. So we're incredibly busy in handling, some of the procurement processes or contracting processes that have come out as a result of COVID. The biggest, I think, uptick or change with COVID in our services is not being in the housing space, but in the mental health space. And we have more and more people accessing our mental health services. And we think that once actually the more serious aspects of lockdown are lifted, that we're actually going to see a real spike in demand for mental health services.
Carolyn and I were having a discussion about this not so long ago, to say that, all the isolation we're really seeing an uptick as well. Sam, there's a question here for you, which is based on the same topic as the alternative pathway. It says that no time to go to a career, middle-aged law student, not going to have time to go through lots of different areas? Is it realistic to head for a boutique law firm, get experience in one area and then change areas later on? Or are you, I guess, limiting yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I guess going to an area of law and then trying to change can be difficult, or traditionally it was. To give you an example, though, of where it's not difficult, we just last week had a lawyer who specialised in strata work, so advisory and litigation dealing with strata units, which is, you know, interesting area for a little bit of time. But they wanted to be a construction lawyer, a litigator, and that had minimal litigation experience, but they were very passionate about it. They projected that in the interview, and they got the job in a construction team with sort of somewhat relevant experience, but not entirely. So that does happen. I think for the top tier law firms, it's tricky for them to hire. If they want a corporate lawyer and you're a litigation lawyer, you're not going to get that job. You know, there would be a stepping stone process within another maybe boutique environment. The other thing I should add on a boutique, just because you select one team doesn't mean you can't move within that boutique. I should have made that clear earlier, because the nature of them is that you often come across different partners, and if you're good and other partners know are good, they're happy to utilize you. So depending on the firm, especially if it's a boutique with different practice groups, I think you can get that diversity. If it's like an employment specialist or an environment planning specialist, I think you'd only apply to them if you wanted to do that, to be honest. If you want variety, I'd stick to they're called general commercial boutiques. That would be the path I'd go, because then you've got different access to different areas and you can get that broad skill and use that how you will. If you go too narrow, it can be problematic, yeah, for sure, unfortunately.
If I might supplement that, Stephanie, if that's all right, I guess a couple of observations. I started in a boutique in my career, and then actually went to top tier after that as a senior lawyer, and I found that my experience at that top tier level was really rich as a senior lawyer. So you know, that might be one pathway that you might want to consider, getting that experience in the mid-tier or a boutique at the start, and then sort of transitioning over into top tier. The other thing that I note is if you ever wanted to become a principal at some point, you do need 3 practice areas to be able to get your unrestricted practicing certificate in New South Wales. So limiting yourself to one area too early, you know, may cut you off from that particular goal.
Very good advice. And Carolyn, you also went through the pathway of starting out at a boutique firm, then moving to a large domestic firm, and now an international firm. Can you speak to us about about how that transition was and the advantages and disadvantages you found in both?
Will do, and I'll actually start by also explaining a little bit about my experience that I went through. Like you, Sam, I actually didn't do a traditional summer clerkship. It was in the very early 90s, in the recession we had to have, so yes, a long time ago. But I did my summer holidays work experience, more than a summer clerkship, actually at the Australian Taxation Office. Sounds quite dry, but it was actually quite interesting. It was an eye-opener as to how the public service would actually look at in-house lawyers. It was an eye-opener as to how they structured their teams and their service delivery as well. And I found that to be quite a rewarding experience, in as much as when I came out the end of it, I knew that that was something I did not want to do. I think that's also another thing. It's not a failure if you do something and then you decide it's not for you. I think that's actually a success, because you've done it and you've worked out that it's not for you. And that's the same with private practice, not for profit, not profit, etc. Give it a go, and if it's not for you, you haven't failed at it. You've actually succeeded in working out what is right for you or what's not right for you. But anyway, the Australian Taxation Office, it was a long time ago, but it was a great experience. And then yes, I started out because it was in the early 90s, and my academic record was not explosive, I must admit. And I started out in a suburban firm and did everything. So to the question that was asked before, a boutique firm specialising, yes, it was boutique in certain areas, but it was a suburban firm. And then I just said yes to do everything, whether or not it was family law, whether or not it was debt recovery, whether or not it was strata, which I ended up then focusing on, whether or not it was insolvency matters, trying a little bit of everything. And then after 3 years, then I moved into the city and started focusing more on property development. So that was an interesting start for me in a challenging environment, which I must admit was not dissimilar then during the GFC in 2008, 9, 10. And as Sam's already spoken about, experiences that we're going through at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic. Although there's differences with all three areas, although we're technically in a recession now as we were in the early 90s, but there's good signs ahead for legal services and the needs for legal services. But the pros and cons, or the positives and negatives of actually being at, say, a boutique or a large national firm versus an international firm, I actually think the lines are blurring somewhat. The differences aren't as remarkable as they used to be, and whether or not that is because of the client types that are coming to the firms, and the clients are somehow are still focusing on, yes, there's some that go to a law firm, but a lot of clients still go to an individual partner at a law firm. Also, perceived or actual heightened levels of regulation and compliance now are actually for all firms to have to deal with. So whether or not that's anti-money laundering or cyber risks or trust account compliance, etc., all firms now have to do that. So that difference, I can see it blurring a bit, the pros and cons between being in the different firms. Indeed, some of the large international firms here in Australia are actually smaller in headcount here in Australia, in their offices here in Australia, than some of the larger firms, or even some of the larger boutique firms here. So there might just be 40 or 50 people in their office here, whereas some of the other Sydney-based national firms might have a presence of 200. So then they're small. So they get a sense of feeling like they're a small boutique, but they're perhaps 40 or 50 people of a global firm that employs 2,000. So what that then informs me about is the culture. We keep hearing that word about law firm culture, and Sam, you've no doubt probably written or spoken about law firm culture as well, and I know Judy's experienced that. But one thing for lawyers looking to find a job is to try and educate yourself as much about the culture of the law firm. Sometimes culture is informed by the strategy of the firm, what the firm wants to be famous for, how the firm positions itself, and then the culture is as a consequence of that. Sometimes it's the other way around. They say we want a firm that has a particular culture, and then we'll create our strategy to make sure we hold on to that culture. The culture of a firm is also made up, in my view, of the individuals at that firm. So it does change over time. But the questions to ask or to consider would be, is that firm looking towards being of a high performance culture, whatever that means, or is it an entrepreneurial culture, whatever that means? Is it a work hard, play hard firm, which I think kind of went out in the 80s, but we'll put that to one side. Is it a firm focusing more on delivery of social justice? So very, very high ethics, very, very high authenticity about what it means to be a lawyer? Or is it a law firm driven by money? Let's be open and frank. So some of the cultures that you will find, not all law firm is the same. And I think going through the assessment process, if you're looking at how you want to identify yourself, maybe we can talk about it a bit later on as well, about the actual, you should work out within yourself what type of practitioner you want to be, and then find a home that then suits. And be game enough that if you end up somewhere and you say, gosh, this isn't for me, then again, to what I was saying before, that's not a failure, that's a revelation, and then you actually carry on. So it's a blurring, I think, of the pros and cons. There are differences, but all I can say is no two law firms are truly the same.
Well, I'm going to, on that note, pass this question to you as well. The first one, because I know you've been providing a lot of feedback to your young lawyers at the firm. Do you have any tips for the best way to ask for feedback from senior colleagues while working from home?
Indeed. Pick up the phone. So, yes, indeed. Asking for feedback from senior colleagues whilst working from home. Put yourself also in the senior colleagues' shoes for a minute and say, well, what's the best way for me to actually get their attention? Maybe make an appointment, book a time, and book a decent period of time. And don't just put the time in their diary or just send a note saying, can we have a discussion? Full stop, question mark. Give them context. Just say, I would like to have a meeting, please, because I'd like some feedback on the tasks that I did last week. And I've gone through the edits to the document and I'd just like to learn from that. You'll find that most senior colleagues go, oh, that's great. This person actually wants to learn, wants to engage, wants to continue progressing. But please, when you do that, the hot tips are give the context about why you want to see them. Otherwise, the senior lawyer will say, oh, it might not be important, or I'm not sure what it's about. So I'm going to I'm going to put it in an importance checklist down the bottom because I'm not sure what it's entirely about, and also be sensitive as to the time limit. If there are other people that you could also ask about, so for example, a support staff member or somebody that works also closely with that senior lawyer, go through them and just say, oh, do you know what they're working on at the moment? Do you think they have any time tomorrow afternoon, etc. Depends how close your relationship is, but make an appointment, pick up the phone. Even if it's not on the phone, get on the visual with Zoom or Teams and actually go through that way. Learn how to screen share with your online tool if you are having a video conference, so the document can come up and you can work through it together, just like you were sitting together 1.5 meters apart going through the document.
Something I'm very bad at. I still don't know how to screen share.
But I hope that helps you with that. Make an appointment, give some context, and be prepared for the discussion.
Thank you. And Judy, I might ask this question of you because you've had experience on both firms. What is the main difference between working in a boutique firm versus a large top-tier firm? The person raising the question says, I haven't had any experience in a law firm, so any insight would be much appreciated. Also, does the nature of the work you do and the hours you work differ between whether you work in a metropolitan area versus rural?
Right, there's a fair bit in those questions, thanks, but they're good ones. So it's really interesting. So I started my practicing life around about the time that Caroline did as well, and so I actually secured a graduate position in a boutique law firm. I wasn't a summer clerk, but I secured a graduate position, and the very next year the early 90s recession happened, and so you know, instinctively I thought, well, this is it, it's all over, you know, but the next 3 years were probably, it was the biggest opportunity I've ever had in my career. And that was because, similarly to today, the partners that I was working for at the time hadn't been through a recession, or the skills base just wasn't there. And so suddenly I went from being a subordinate to a peer, all, you know, in the blink of an eye, we were all learning together. So what I would say is actually, you know, in an environment like this, there are opportunities that actually might not actually be around in you know, times when the economy is absolutely cracking. So keep an eye out for that. In terms of the difference between a boutique and a top tier, I found that my boutique experience was, whilst we had specialists, the specialists were also generalists. So the experience that I actually obtained was a more all-around holistic experience. So it's probably fair to say that in a smaller place, you get to know a lot, basically the bulk of the people Whereas if you're working in a huge firm of 200 people, that's a little bit more difficult. So there's a little bit more of a personal connection to people who might be outside of your group or team that's available. I found that when I went to in a top tier firm, the specialties were far more strict. So, for example, my background is actually in property, like Carolyn, it's in property law and development. But when I was working for a boutique, I actually had to do the financing work as well. When I went to the top tier, that tends to get, their practice was to hive it off and hand it over to the banking and finance team. And so I found that, you know, as a junior lawyer, your experience might be far more wider in a more generalist skill set working in a boutique. In terms of hours of work, I think I worked just as hard in a boutique than I did in a top tier firm. The reality of law firm life is when it's on, when the deal, you know, it's particularly in transactional work. I can't speak for litigation, but in transactional work, when the deal is on, that's when we have to be on. And so, you know, provided that you have sufficient time for recovery in between the deals, I think you are expected to work hard. I think the other thing I found in working in a top tier, just the level of expertise that the firm has built up in some ways, there's a lot of depth to it in a whole lot of areas. And so if you have some esoteric query or something in the matter that you had, you can always find someone to actually help you solve the issue. In a boutique, you have to be a little bit more self-reliant. And find, you know, novel ways of finding the answer. So the skill set that you build up in a boutique is somewhere that helps you with your legal independence and developing, I think, to maturity quicker than you would otherwise than if you actually just start in a huge firm where you're only having a small slice of a matter. I mean, I guess that's the other big thing that when I started in a boutique, I remember on day 2, my supervising partner walked in, who actually became a really good mentor to me. But on day 2, walked in and said, XYZ clients needs a lease drawn. Here's the precedent. Off you go. So, you know, you do build up a lot of skills of self-reliance and abilities to come up with some novel solutions. In terms of the sorry. Going to go into the second half of that question. I've never actually worked in a rural firm, although I have worked, I did a tour of Judy at Spark Hillmore, which, as Sam mentioned, is a big Newcastle, has a big Newcastle presence. So I did visit them on occasion, and I think you'll probably find the vibe that I got in working for a rural firm. In a rural setting, they tend to really appreciate their professional services firms because they're an integral part of the community. You don't get that vibe so much in an urban setting. So I think it's a more personable experience overall.
Judy, your Mission Australia has hosted a number of students through intern projects through universities. Would you be able to speak to us a bit about that and some of the benefits that you see from these type of programs?
Yeah, so we're connected with a few universities, and some of those universities actually have mandated an internship as part of their undergraduate law degree requirements, which I think is a terrific thing. We benefit greatly out of those particular internships. I suppose in a lot of ways we get to actually help the interns to develop their skills and give them some insights on what working in an in-house legal team is like. But also we get to actually learn from them as well. And so, you know, it gives us insights into what are the issues that are uppermost minds in younger lawyers coming through, and not necessarily in their capacity as lawyers, but in their capacity as human beings. And so from a relational perspective, there's some real benefits there. The other real benefits for us is that's generally where we draw our pool of paralegaling from. So whilst you might come in for a 4-week internship, you know, depending on your performance, and when I say performance, we're not expecting, you know, you to be able to draft a 50-page contract out of the bat, but if you can actually, if you're keen and perceptive and pick up things quickly, even if you don't know the answer and can't take it right through to the nth level, if you can demonstrate that you've thought about it and are willing to actually pick up and learn new skills, then, you know, that's probably all it takes, really. So we basically draw up our list of pool paralegals that we draw in on specific projects when we need to, from those internship experiences. We've had one or two of our interns come in and convert to full-time employees off the back of a few tours of being a paralegal. They understand the way, you know, our organisation operates, which is quite different to a law firm, particularly because we deal with a lot of our clients have varying degrees of legal sophistication, and you basically have to be able to tailor and communicate to them difficult legal concepts in a way they can understand. We've also had experience where the paralegal opportunities that we've provided from being an intern, they've gone on and got jobs in private practice. So there are a whole lot of benefits as well. And the other one, which is probably not directly relevant to job seeking per se, but a great way to discover and start a mentor-mentee relationship, and have that with you in your career, no matter where you are.
Thank you. And Sam, there's a question that's been raised, which I think is probably a good one for you. It says, I interviewed this week for a junior solicitor position at a small suburban firm. They raised a training wage of $40,000 to $45,000 salary plus super. The principal also expects early morning, evening and weekend availability. Is this realistic?
It's a tough one. I mean, it depends on the firm as to whether that's realistic or not. I think when I was a grad back in 2004, my starting wage was $45,000 plus super. So I think that probably tells that person where to know that that's probably under market. However, it depends. It depends where the firm is, what type of work they're doing, what their budget is, and how familiar they are with recruiting junior lawyers, because some of them don't necessarily have an idea. But just from that brief overview, I would say that's below market. But at the same time, you know, as a junior, I think experience counts for more than the dollars. So, you know, I think I always say to junior lawyers, because we get 1 year, 2 year, 3 year lawyers come to us, and they're always, some of them trying to haggle over $5,000 or $7,000, $8,000. I always say to them, look, picture yourself where you're going to be in 2 years' time, because that's when you start making money and you want to build up the skills. So if it's the firm this person's genuine about, they've got good work, perhaps ask for more money. You know, I would personally, but don't discount it because you feel like it's slightly under, if you feel like it's a good pathway. But it's hard for me to comment on that without knowing who they are in any detail, to be honest.
And Carolyn, a question for you. You mentioned earlier in the call that there were discussions ongoing with mutual recognition of law degrees between the UK and Australia. Is there any indication of when this may come into effect? I have a UK law degree and I'm currently studying 5 modules in Australia.
I would say just keep studying those 5 modules, because to the Australia-UK trade agreement being finalised and negotiated, so it's probably at least 2 years away. And in addition to that, it will probably be phased in 2 stages. So the point of making that comment before is for the longer term as to what we're going to see regarding the transportability of lawyers around the globe. But I'm sorry for that person who's asked the question. It's probably at least a couple of years away from materialising.
All right, well, we're nearly at time. Unless there's any other questions, we might wrap it up there. Oh, there's one more that's come through. Do panel members have recommendations for skills or attitudes that would help early stage lawyers to secure a role? I might hand this one to Carolyn.
Thank you. You've got to care about delivery of quality and excellence and come across with that, but also to secure a role, you just can't be too oversensitive, really. You need to be able to accept and embrace criticism. You need to be able to compartmentalise certain issues, get a mentor, informal or formal, and download any issues you have with that mentor for your own mental well-being. But to help secure a role, you've got to show that passion, but just be authentic. Be authentic and hold your integrity, and then you'll be hopefully happy in your chosen profession as well. It's don't apologise. You are what you are. Be authentic. Hold your integrity, but you just can't be oversensitive in private practice, because there will be times when people are criticising, and they may well be the clients that pay the bills.
Thank you. And we've had another question come through, but we're at time now. So if there are any more questions, do feel free to email the panellists, and I'm sure they will be willing to answer those. Thank you to all our panellists today for attending and providing insights. I think it's been really helpful. And if you want any information on the next webinar for Welcome to Law, it's on the Women Lawyers Association New South Wales website. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.